I'd like to explore with you what I think is one of the most important and one of the most famous passages in all the Bible. This is well worth our while to consider. This comes to us from the Sermon on the Mount, and this is Jesus speaking. He says, "Enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction, and those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life, and those who find it are few." So here he talks about contrast. He talks about two different destinations, two different paths, two different gates, and two different types of people. Let's start off by talking about the destinations. The destinations here are described as destruction and as life. Destruction and life. Now, destruction and life, what do these mean? Well, let's look if there's any other place in the Bible that has life contrasted with something. Well, there are other places, and even one place in this very book. Let's look at Matthew 18:8. Matthew 18:8. Matthew 18:8 says, "And if your hand or your foot causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to enter life, crippled or lame, than with 2 hands or 2 feet to be thrown into the eternal fire." So here there's a contrast. Enter life, similar idea there, is contrasted with eternal fire. Now, for this reason and for numbers of other reasons, I would say that what's going on here is destruction is meaning hell, damnation. It means eternal punishment, being separated from God forever. Now, life then means eternal life, that is, to be with God, one of the blessed who enjoy Him forever. Eternity seems to be in mind in this passage. Now, this makes what we're about to talk about of absolute, immense, paramount importance, because eternity is so long. This life is just a blink of an eye, and we want to step into eternity well, step into life. Now, he talks about gates and paths. Let's talk about gates next. He talks about two different gates. One of them he calls the wide gate, and one of them he calls the narrow gate. Now, what does he mean when he says narrow gate? John chapter 10, verse 9 says, Jesus says, "I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture." So Jesus here is saying, I am the door. It's a similar concept to gate, so I conclude that Jesus himself is the gate, and entering by him is the way to be saved, like it says in John chapter 10, verse 9. But what does this mean exactly? What does it mean to enter by Jesus? What does it mean that he is the gate? Well, the New Testament in many places describes salvation as coming through faith in Jesus Christ. So one enters it through faith. But faith is different from what most people think, because here it's a narrow gate. It's not just believing like most people think. It's something more. It's belief in the New Testament sense is a self-surrendering faith. It's something that takes up the cross and renounces their life and follows Jesus Christ. It's where one submits to his authority. One will commit themselves to living for him. Now, this is what makes it a narrow gate. Now, what about the path? He talks about paths as being easy, or he talks about them being broad. He talks about them being easy here or hard. Easy or hard. Now, a lot of other translations might say a broad path for easy and a narrow or constricted or constrained path for the hard. Now, let's talk about hard. That very Greek word, or or a related Greek word, is translated as affliction or afflicted or some related word like that in other places in the New Testament. For example, 2 Corinthians 7:5 says, "For even when we came into Macedonia, our bodies had no rest, but we were afflicted at every turn, fighting without and fear within." So he talks about the conflicts that he has and describes them as affliction. Similarly, in Mark 3:9, this is another use of that word. He told his disciples to have the boat ready for him, to have a boat ready for him because of the crowd, lest they crush him. So here's so many people wanting to hear Jesus, so many crowds that are afraid that he would crush him. Similar word that you see with regards to hard. So what does this mean? This is something that with respect to a path seems to best to mean constricted or constrained, narrow, in contrast to the broad or easy way. Now the broad way seems, in my mind, when I think of broad, I see a level road that's very wide, that's got a lot of room to maneuver. It's just a pleasant road to drive down. And then when I think of a hard path, I think of a trail that has maybe not much room for maneuverability. Maybe it's got potholes in it. It's something that's just hard to deal with. It's not as easy a path to go down. Now, what is it that makes, so this is a metaphor, but what does it represent? I'm going to claim that this represents doing the will of God. Doing the will of God, I think, is what this represents. Now, for evidence for that, if one just simply goes down a little bit further and checks out what happens in Matthew chapter 7, just a few verses later, verse 21, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven." That is, that's the person that's going to enter, the one that does the will of my Father. So I'm going to claim that what's meant here by the hard path is doing the will of my Father, doing the will of God. Now, this is supported by another passage from the New Testament. This is John, 1 John, chapter 2, verse 17. It says, "And the world is passing away along with its desires, but whoever does the will of God abides forever." So here again, doing the will of God, and then that person is the one that will abide or live forever. Now, this makes perfect sense in the context of this passage, because you see, Jesus just had been talking about his moral codes that he requires for his disciples. This is the will of God. And many people will want to say, "Oh, that's just so hard. That's just too restrictive. I don't want to do that." And Jesus is saying, don't be like most people. You must do this. This is the right path. And he's giving us motivation by saying, this is the path that leads to life. Now, I'm not claiming that this is the path that causes one to deserve heaven or to merit heaven. No, I think that this shows that one really has been regenerated by God, that God has made them alive, that they have had true faith, and that they are on the right path to heaven. Now, if I was to then conclude with the different types of people, the two different types of people, Jesus is urging us, it's in the imperative, enter by the narrow gate. He's urging us, take this small path. This is the right way. Don't go with the crowd. Thank you for your time.